Imagine a Detroit night in 1970, V8s howling like wild animals, taillights glowing through clouds of burnt rubber, and teenage kings dueling on cracked asphalt strips that served as the gladiator arenas of their time. This wasn't just street racing, it was war, and the weapons, Ford Torino Cobras, Chevelle SS454s, Boss 351s, and Hemi Cudas, each more outrageous than the last. The post-war optimism had started to morph into something more reckless. The American muscle era wasn't born in a boardroom. It was forged in a place where gasoline was cheap, rules were vague, and your worth could be measured in quarter miles. Dodge, Ford, Chevy, Plymouth, Buick. They weren't building cars, they were engineering rebellion. Every badge was a challenge. Every ignition key was a call to arms. But here's where things start to go insane. Most of these iconic 70s cars were lying to you, on purpose. You'd read 360 horsepower in the brochure, but that engine was secretly capable of nearly 450. Why? Because if the insurance companies ever found out what these machines were really capable of, no teenager would have ever gotten their hands on one. What you saw on paper was factory underrated horsepower, numbers tweaked and sanded down, all to sneak under insurance radar. By the time the 426 Hemi made it into cars like the Dodge Challenger and the Plymouth Roadrunner, America wasn't just building cars, it was building legends. Even back then, drag strip culture knew something the automakers wouldn't say out loud. The Hemi Cuda top speed wasn't just fast, it was terrifying. People weren't just driving them, they were surviving them. So before we talk about the lies, the legends, and the long-lost icons, let me ask you something. What if the real danger wasn't in how fast they went, but how easily they made us fall in love with danger? Because from this point on, every car you thought you knew from the 70s might not be what it claimed, and we're just getting warmed up. Factory lies and hidden horsepower, the great American cover-up. Here's the dirty secret nobody at the dealership would tell you in 1970. Those horsepower numbers, mostly fiction, not because the cars were weak, but because they were monsters disguised in plain specs. Welcome to the great American cover-up of muscle car history. Back then, automakers played a shady game using something called gross horsepower, measured with the engine sitting on a bench. No accessories, no exhaust, no restrictions. Think of it as measuring a boxer's punch before tying his gloves on, but even that number was manipulated. In 1971, the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, introduced net horsepower ratings, which reflected more realistic, real-world numbers. Overnight, cars lost 30 to 50% of their power on paper without a single part change. But nothing had really changed under the hood, just the narrative. Take the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. On the sticker, it said 360 horsepower, but anyone who actually ran one on the dyno knew better. It pulled over 420. It ran 13.38 seconds in the quarter-mile stock, which in 1970 was absurd. That's faster than most modern turbocharged four-cylinders can dream of. Then there were the sleeper cars. Cars like the Ford Torino Cobra or the Chevelle SS454 that didn't look flashy, but could vaporize tires at stoplights. Reviewers from Motor Trend and Car and Driver in the early 70s were already whispering it. These cars were way faster than they were letting on. Some tests of the LS6 Corvette showed sub-12 second quarter-mile times straight from the factory. This manipulation wasn't just clever, it created a legacy, a whisper network of hot rodders, street racers, and gearheads who knew the truth. Horsepower manipulation wasn't just survival, it was strategy. It made these classic American cars even more desirable. And guess what? The real numbers, the raw specs, don't tell the full story, because what made these 1970s drag strip legends so iconic wasn't just the power, it was the feeling that you had something forbidden, something untamed. And in part 3, we're going to pull the curtain back even further on the rarest, angriest machines you've probably never even heard of. Violent elegance. The most insane muscle cars you forgot existed. Some cars shout, others whisper, and then destroy you at a red light. That's what made the forgotten heroes of the 1970s muscle era so terrifying. These weren't just cars, they were contradictions on wheels. Smooth chrome, sleek lines, plush interiors, and then bam, drag strip fury that left even seasoned racers humbled. Then there's the 1971 Boss 351 Mustang. Everyone talks about the Boss 429, but the Boss 351, it was the real street weapon. Lighter, quicker off the line, and in many road tests, faster than the 429. With just 1,806 built, it's one of the most underrated muscle cars Ford ever released. It hit 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds, and it screamed past the competition with a ferocity that made it a sleeper car in its own era. The 1971 Corvette LS6 is even more mysterious. Only 188 were ever built. Yes, 188. This was GM's last stand before the emissions era took over. It had a 454 cubic inch V8, officially rated at 425 horsepower, but most insiders believe it was closer to 500. It's so rare that even seasoned collectors sometimes forget it existed. Today, one of the rarest Corvettes ever built. And then we circle back to the Buick SS454 Stage 1, a car that looked like your uncle's Sunday cruiser, but had a 510 pound-foot torque rating, making it one of the highest torque engines ever put into a production car at the time. It was smooth, quiet, but when you hit the gas, it turned into a torque monster. In 1970, Motor Trend named it the fastest muscle car they'd ever tested. That's right, not a Hemi, a Buick. Auction houses like Mecum and Barrett-Jackson now treat these cars like rolling treasure. Bidders get emotional. You'll see grown men tearing up as the gavel drops on a Hemi Cuda or a Chevelle SS454 in unrestored condition. It's not just nostalgia. It's the realization that these vintage muscle cars were never supposed to survive. They were made for burnout smoke and rebellion, not for velvet ropes and collector brochures. Coming up next, things get even weirder. Wings, cartoon horns, and NASCAR madness that turned engineering into performance art. You thought you'd seen insane. Just wait. Horns, wings, and insanity when muscle went full cartoon. By 1970, the muscle car war wasn't just about horsepower. It was about how outrageous you could make a street-legal missile without getting arrested or laughed off the showroom floor. And that's when things got truly insane. Let's talk about the Plymouth Superbird. A car so outrageous, it looked like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon. It had a massive 23-inch wing bolted onto the rear and a nose cone that could slice wind like a missile. Why? Because Plymouth didn't care about street cool anymore. They wanted NASCAR dominance. That wing wasn't for style. It was engineered for aerodynamic supremacy at 200 miles per hour. This was a uniquely American moment. European automakers focused on grace, curves, and balance. Meanwhile, Detroit was designing cars with wings like fighter jets, named after birds, cartoons, and snakes. The Dodge Daytona, the Superbird's cousin, was just as insane. Both cars were banned from NASCAR shortly after because they were simply too effective. And collectors today, they've gone absolutely crazy for these oddballs. A Superbird with a 426 Hemi sold for over $3.5 million at auction. And here's the irony. Back then, you could barely give them away. Some sat for over a year on dealer lots. Why? Because people thought they were too weird, too aggressive, too much. But in that weirdness was a kind of magic. These weren't just cars, they were rolling declarations that American automakers weren't done experimenting. They were statements of rebellion wrapped in fiberglass and wing bolts. The Mopar muscle cars of that era weren't trying to fit in. They were designed to win, to shock, to intimidate. That was the final gasp of unfiltered creativity before the storm hit. Because what came next, it wasn't just a decline, it was a collapse. And it hit harder than anyone expected. In the next part, we watch as the curtain fell on the muscle era and what survived when the smoke cleared. The final roar, when the curtain dropped on the muscle era. It didn't end with a bang, it ended with a sputter. Between 1971 and 1973, the muscle car era flatlined. Not because people stopped loving fast cars, but because the system declared war on them. The government clamped down. First came the emissions crackdown in 1971. Then the insurance companies hiked premiums for anything with a big block. Add the 1973 oil embargo, and suddenly, gas-guzzling vintage V8s went from dream machines to dangerous liabilities. Car buyers shifted, manufacturers panicked. And what did Detroit do? They neutered the beasts. It wasn't just about horsepower, it was about the entire culture collapsing. The 1970s drag strip legends faded, street racing cooled. What used to be a ritual, kids pulling up in sleeper muscle builds ready to destroy egos, became a risk no one could afford. The vibe shifted from loud rebellion to quiet retreat. But something strange happened. Those cars didn't disappear, they just went underground, stored in barns, kept alive by muscle car collectors who knew what they had. Hidden muscle gems that only the obsessed remembered. The few who kept restoring them, rebuilding the engines, swapping parts from forgotten catalogs, they became guardians of an outlaw legacy. Today, Hemi Cudas, Buick GSXs, Ford Torino Cobras, they don't just represent speed, they represent defiance. A time when the rules hadn't caught up yet, when Detroit Big Three were building street-legal monsters and no one was stopping them. We lost something when the muscle era died, not just torque or throttle response, but but attitude, a kind of raw, analog, emotionally reckless spirit that doesn't show up in modern spec sheets. You didn't buy those cars to drive safely, you bought them to feel something. But the story isn't over, because even now, decades later, these machines are making grown men tear up at auctions, shake at ignition, and smile like kids again. And in the final part, we'll talk about why these cars still haunt our memories, why they still move us, even when they're standing still. More than numbers, why these cars still make grown men cry. Let's be honest, today's cars are faster, on paper anyway. A 2025 EV can hit 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds without breaking a sweat. But you know what it can't do? Make your heart race before you even turn the key. That's something only the classic muscle performance legends of the 1970s knew how to do. There's a moment I'll never forget. I got the chance to drive a borrowed 71 Hemi Cuda, plum crazy purple, untouched interior, original 426 under the hood. I wasn't ready. The steering was heavy. The brakes were stubborn, and every bump in the road felt like a test of my spine. But when I hit the gas, it was like the world blurred and my soul punched the windshield. That car wasn't trying to keep me safe. It was trying to remind me I was alive. And maybe that's what makes the muscle car era so special. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polite. It was loud, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, but always unforgettable. Every dent had a story. Every rev was a protest. These weren't cars, they were confessions on wheels. So here's my ask to you. Share your story. Tell me about the car you lost, the one you still dream about, or the time your uncle lit up a back road in a Ford Torino sleeper while your jaw hit the dashboard. I'll feature the best stories in next week's video, because this isn't just my journey, it's ours. These cars weren't made to last, but somehow they did. Not just in garages or auctions, but in the hearts of those who remember them. The golden age of muscle may be over, but it's only dead if we forget it. And I promise you, we won't.